This Friday is the start of the 10th Rugby World Cup, which France is hosting, and it'll get off to a blockbuster start. Les Bleus will play New Zealand in the opener, a matchup largely seen as amongst the most powerful in Rugby World Cup history. But there's no shortage of strong teams this year. South Africa, New Zealand, and France are, of course, among the favorites. But Ireland, too, currently the best team in the world, has high hopes, especially as it's never won a knockout game at the World Cup. Paul Rouse joins me for perspective now for more. He's a professor at University College Dublin, specialized in the history of Irish and global sport. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's start then with Ireland. Visibly a great team, especially over the past 14 months, the world's number one, but it hasn't managed to make it past a pattern of underperformance at the World Cup. What's going on?
There's been a whole load of different reasons to explain the failures of the past to get beyond the quarterfinal stage. But instead of dwelling on the past on this occasion, the belief is that this current group of players, who I have to say I had the great pleasure to meet and do some work with earlier this year, are in a totally different place than previous teams. They have a record of achievement and they have a depth of squad that was not present in the past. So there is a genuine optimism about the Irish presence in France and the opportunities to go very deep in this competition.
Now, everyone is, of course, excited about that matchup between France and New Zealand, but France and Ireland also have a history of enthralling play together, and you're behind an exhibit on rugby relations between the two nations currently displayed here in Paris. Can you tell us more about their rivalry?
So the rivalry extends back more than 120 years, and it is, of course, rooted around a sporting contest between two nations in rugby matches, but it extends far beyond that into a social and cultural, economic and indeed political ties between the two countries. The exhibition is on every afternoon from today onwards, in the Centre Culturel Irlandais, which is near Pantheon in Paris. And it's open to everybody who's interested in rugby and indeed in cultural ties, because it tells the story of 120 years of matches, but it also tells the stories on which people such as Samuel Beckett walk across, and their love of rugby and indeed love of contest between people. And it's a cultural exchange as well as just an attempt to win a rugby match.
Hearing you talk about how it's a cultural exchange, how there's politics mixed up in that, makes me think about a quote that's been attributed to Oscar Wilde, where he essentially says that rugby is a game for barbarians played by gentlemen. Football is a game for gentlemen played by barbarians. I suppose it seeks to explain some of the things that you just mentioned, and also why there's maybe more hooliganism in football. How do you explain then the sociological difference between rugby and football?
Oh, you explain it in terms of class, and you explain it in terms of education. In the first instance, in Ireland, for example, for many years, the centre of the Irish rugby system is the public school system, as in the fee-paying school system. And in France, initially, it was the elite of French society, who looked across the channel to England for inspiration, that developed this Anglophilia, where they took rugby as the game of the elite initially. So it set itself up not just as a game of the elite, but also a game of the amateur. For more than 100 years, it was the preserve of amateurs, and it was a very particular social cachet around this game.
Do you think that that's changed? I mean, I think you could argue that rugby and its fan base have evolved significantly, at least in the past 15 years or so. What are some of the major transformations that you've seen?
Oh, it absolutely has evolved, and it's driven by professionalisation in the middle of the 1990s, because you cannot have a professional sport if you do not have a mass of people who are willing both to pay through the gate, buy TV subscriptions and buy merchandising. So you must have that. And to do that, you cannot remain the preserve of any particular section of society. Your desire is to spread across all sections of society. And to be fair to rugby in both France and Ireland, there has been an attempt which extends before professionalisation to that. But what professionalisation did was make it an imperative for it to happen. And that is what has driven the changes in rugby.
Do you think it's driven more interest in rugby? It's also arguably, again, less popular than football, but that does seem to be, at least it seems to be getting a little bit more popular.
Oh, it is definitely less popular. But if you want to compare any game to soccer around the world, it is going to be less popular. And where rugby is in a contest for hearts and minds, as all sports are. Look at the rise, for example, of basketball over the course, particularly of the last 40 years, to its growth in areas. Every year, every sport that wishes to thrive must push out its boundaries. To stagnate means you are actually in decline when it comes to spreading your sport. Now, it must be said that rugby is under pressure in a lot of countries to finance itself, and it has struggled to develop a competitive beyond a very small number of countries who can win a World Cup or compete significantly in it. And it is an ongoing challenge for rugby to successfully meet those challenges.
The French team, Paul, has been managing that racism scandal in recent days. That lock forward Bastien Chalureau, who in 2020 was convicted for assaulting two people and using racist language. Now, he's denied the racial element, but some were outraged that he was called up for the opening game despite this. As a historian, I'm curious to hear your perspective. Do you think sports players have always been as scrutinized as they are today for their lives off of the field? And do you think it's a reasonable thing to expect that these kind of athletes on the world stage not have these types of stories?
Oh, I think we're all being scrutinized in our lives much more than has been the case, and it is unreasonable to expect sports to be different than other aspects of society in terms of the range of beliefs, the failings of people around the place. And in terms of scrutiny, I think anybody in any environment who says anything that is racist has no place in any environment and in any institution. And that is a simple view. So it must be called out wherever it is. What is really interesting, however, is the number of sports people who, over the last decade in particular, use their platform now to engage in social and political and indeed economic protest and campaigns. And it is actually, it's magnificent to see, because we cannot have it both ways. We cannot, on the one hand, condemn sports people for being somehow not particularly bright, not particularly engaged, not living in the realities of people's world, and then campaign at the same time when they do get involved in campaigns. So I would regard it as this engagement as a positive.
Paul Rouse, we just have a few seconds left, but I have to ask you, who do you think is going to win this year?
Oh, I think Ireland are going to win the World Cup.
Okay, no bias there, I imagine. Fair enough. I will say, Paul Rouse, you have managed to spark my interest in this sport for the first time ever. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for your expertise. And I, too, will look forward to watching the match tonight. Thank you.